This conference will now be recorded.
Hello. Yes, sir.
Good
Yes, sir.
morning
Good
to you,
morning, sir.
sir.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we are ready. So what we planned for this session is Hibernate, right? So we thought to have two Hibernate sessions. Yeah, if you have already idea about Hibernate, that is fine. Just two sessions. Um, be patient and follow these two sessions. Okay, you can brush up your knowledge. Um, if not, okay, it will help you really. It will help you a lot. Hmm. So we started our once done with Spring Core discussion, right? We started with Spring JDBC, and from JDBC we understand the importance of connection pooling. Okay, we understand the importance of connection pooling. Without connection pool, if we implement application, we see the network traffic between applications and the lag, performance lag, and the exceptions also we used to get when we have multiple users request. So when we saw that problems, we realized that connection pool will provide the solutions for that. So to create connection pools, we have multiple implementations that also even we discussed. Connection pool in the sense it will create multiple connections at the time of application startup itself. It will bring all the connections into a pool and it will maintain connections here only until you shut down your application. So for our CRUD operations, for every CRUD operation, we need to fetch a connection from pool. And once we're done with our CRUD operation, we need to give the connection back to connection pool so that you can improve a lot of application performance. Not only that, we can even make users wait if connections are not available. That waiting time also we can set by using connection pools. That is also one great feature that we have. So connection pool implementations are for data source implementations only. Data source is an interface. For that interface, basic data source, combo pool data source, and there are many data source implementations we have. All of them are implemented from data source only. Okay, so when we use this basic data source or the combo pool data source, just we need to set the driver URL, username, passwords, and the required maximum number of connections. So based upon your database, right? If I set 100 for my local database, it won't support because it has maximum 20 connections only. So if it is a commercial database, maybe it might have up to 100 connections or 200 connections, concurrent connections. Okay, if they are commercial, they will provide this many connections. So set as many as you want based on your database capability, so that that many connections it will create it in the pool, so that you can utilize that many parallel connections to do your CRUD operations. Okay, so this is what we discussed here at. This is for the JDBC. Okay, this is for the JDBC style of implementation. Now, on top of this, right, on top of JDBC, Spring given JDBC template for making easy of our CRUD operations. Using connection pool, you can create JDBC template or named parameter JDBC template. They given some methods to do CRUD operations like update, execute query, okay, for doing select operations and all. Okay, so by using that methods, what we can do directly, we can execute our CRUD operations without worrying about opening connections and closing connections. We need not to worry about the resource leakage issues here. Directly, we can use these template classes. Okay, so template classes will make the JDBC easier here. So apart from this JDBC, do we have anything for doing CRUD operations? Means yes, we have ORM tools also. So okay, we have ORM tools also. ORM, by using ORM tools also we can able to do CRUD operations. Okay, so we will talk about one ORM tool here. ORM stands for Object to Relational Database Mapping. ORM stands for Object Relational Database Mapping. In general, we call Object Relational Mapping. Object Relational Mapping. I used to call it as Object Relational Database Mapping. Objects we can map to relational databases. Okay, RDBMS systems basically. Nowadays we can use ORM for NoSQL databases also. Okay, so ORM stands for object relational mapping, object relation mapping, object relational mapping we call it as. So what is the benefit with the ORM? Using JDBC itself we are able to do CRUD operations. So when we implement a when we implement a application with front-end views, controllers and services, for doing CRUD operations, finally we implement DO classes here. Finally we use DO classes here for doing CRUD operations. When we pass some data from view, the data we read from controller, and the controller will send it to service. And once getting here, once we getting the request into service, we forward the same service to DAO. DAO will do all the basic operations here, CRUD operations. It will do all the DB operations, insert, update or delete. Yeah, so it need to do all the CRUD operations here. So basically for doing this CRUD operations, what we know so far is JDBC. So here for doing this CRUD operations, so far we know is JDBC. By using JDBC we can able to do all the required CRUD operations, Java database connectivity, or else by using Spring JDBC. On top of JDBC, Spring provided some easy JDBC style, we can use this. So apart from this, we can use ORM tool also. Apart from this, we can use ORM tool also here, like Hibernate for doing CRUD operations. Hibernate, we can use Hibernate for doing all the CRUD operations here. And on top of Hibernate, Spring given integration also. Spring ORM. We can use Spring ORM when you want to integrate Spring with Hibernate, right? Like Spring JDBC, we have Spring ORM also for doing CRUD operations. How this ORM tools helps? How this ORM tools will help here? If you want to see. So basically here, when we submit the data, when we submit some form data, consider this is the registration. User data you are sending, username, email, address, name, email, address data you are sending here. When we send this data here, generally we read the data in controller. Okay, we read the data in controller and we create a model class like student model class. Into that model class, we populate this data. Inside controller also what we do, we get the data into our model class. We create a poser class like student. Into that poser class, we get the name, email, address data. So when we use Spring MVC, right, MVC will do what? Directly it will populate data into this model. So into this model, directly your view data, it will populate. Your view data will be populated here into this bean class. So this bean class we will get here as a input. The bean itself as an input we will get here. Student bean we will get. Inside this bean, what we will have all this form data, name, email, address data. Same student class, same student bean class, we forward it. So we get the data here and the same object we forward it to controller. I mean from controller to service. The same POSO object or bean object we forward it to DAO. So once we get into DAO, if you are doing JDBC operations, what you need to do? If you want to save the data into table, here I have a student table with student name, email, address. I have same columns here, name, email, address. So when you want to do CRUD operations, on this table, what you need to do? I got the data in the form of POSO class. Instead of using request dot get name, get parameter of name, get parameter of email, get parameter of address, instead of using that HTTP methods here, directly Spring will provide you this form data as a object. Same object we forward. To DAO also. The same object we forward to service and service to DAO. Now when you want to save it, in case of JDBC style, what you need to do? You need to read the data from your POSO class and you need to present the data into SQL query. You need to read, and you will combine that data through your SQL query. In case of JDBC, what you do, you write the SQL query like insert into the table name student values and each value you will read from your student object, student dot get name, right? By calling getter methods, student dot get name, student dot get email, student dot get address. You will read all the parameters from your bean class, and you will join with that values with your SQL query, and finally you will run this SQL query by using JDBC statement or prepare statement. Finally, we run this SQL query. What we are doing here in JDBC, we are creating SQL query, and finally we are combining our POSO data and this data finally by using execute statement or statement, by using statement or by using prepare statement, by using statement or prepared statement, we run this query on table in case of JDBC. When it comes to ORM, right? When it comes to ORM, you need not to worry about this SQL creation and binding your data. When it comes to ORM, you need not to create this SQL query and you need not to read the data and bind it with your SQL. When it comes to ORM, you no need to do this job. You no need to do this job. When it is a ORM, what you can do is, when it is a ORM, we pass our data to ORM tool. Consider here you are using Hibernate. Here you are using Hibernate in place of JDBC. So I'm using Hibernate here. I'm using Hibernate here. So to this Hibernate, what you need to give? Your poser class. So whatever poser class object you got from the user, right? Same poser class object you need to pass it to Hibernate. You need to pass this poser class object to Hibernate, and you need not to do anything. You need to give it to Hibernate. Hibernate will take care of insertion. Okay, Hibernate will insert directly this data into your table. It will take care of reading your data. It will take care of forming this SQL query, and it will insert it. This is the primary feature that we have from Hibernate. When we use Hibernate as a developer, you need not to worry about this SQL queries. You need not to worry about how to bind the data into SQL query. You just simply give your object to Hibernate. It will save it on table. In case if you want to data from table, okay, it can able to return you in the same format also. When you want data from your table, when you want a particular single record or multiple records, Hibernate will read data for you, and finally it will convert it into your POSO class. It will convert it into your POSO class, and it will give it to you as a POSO class object only. Directly it will give you object as this POSO class. In earlier JDBC, we see the difficulty, right? If you want return data also in the form of POSO class, you need to read it through result set, and you need to do set values into this POSO class, or else you need to implement row mapper. In Hibernate, you need not to do anything here. If you want to save, give your object to Hibernate. Hibernate will save. If you want to data, ask Hibernate to get the data. It will return to you in the form of student object. Okay, so that's why we are calling it as object to database mapping tool. So this object directly it will map to your tables. Who will do that? Hibernate will do that. Directly your objects will be mapped to tables. Directly your objects will be mapped to tables. That is the job of Hibernate. Object to relational database mapping. Object to relational database mapping. What if I use Hibernate? You can reduce a lot of development time. You need not to fiddle with the SQL queries. You don't need not to worry about your SQL queries, how to form SQL query for doing save operations or update operations. As a Java developer, you just do only Java based operations. You need not to do any SQL operations. You need not to worry about any SQL queries here. As a Java developer, you just use here your POSO classes and pass that POSO classes to Hibernate. So Hibernate will take care of saving your data into table and retrieve the table. So that is what the benefit with Hibernate. Okay. So that's why we call it as object relational mapping tool. Okay, how it will save. So here I have an object. So I created a student object by using student st equal to new student. I created a student object, and I'm putting some data into the student object, student dot set name, I'll give a name here. I'll give an email here. And I'll give an address here. Name, email, address. Okay. So I have a student object with this data. So when you pass this data, directly the values will be saved into your object. Now your data is there in your object. The data will sit into your object. From this object to you need to move it to from this object to you need to move it into table. Okay. From this object to you need to move this to database table. How to move? I know how to create bean class. It's a simple, right? We need to create class student with the properties name, email, address along with respect to setters and getters. Okay, it is mandatory that we need to maintain setter and as well as getters in Hibernate. Okay, setter methods and as well as getter methods in Hibernate. Okay, we create a poser class this way. We create a poser class this way for doing CRUD operations, right? So I'll get the data in the form of poser class from my controller to service, service to DAO, and I want to save this poser class. This data population also will be happen at controller layer on. Now I want to save this in database. I want to use Hibernate. So here I have a Hibernate tool. Hibernate tool will helps me to save this data. This Hibernate tool will helps me to save the data. To save the data on underlying database. Database can be anything. Okay, while you are using Hibernate, you need not to worry about which database you are using. Is it Oracle? Fine. MySQL? Fine. DB2? Very fine. Any database. You use any database, you need not to worry about your queries. Even today you are using Oracle, tomorrow you want to change it to MySQL, change it. You need not to change even any code or MySQL to DB2, change it. You can use any database which you want. Hibernate is providing almost all databases supports. So we need to give this data, we need to pass this data to Hibernate. For doing save operation in Hibernate, there is a method name called save method. Okay, for doing save operation in Hibernate, we have a method name called save method. So just we need to pass our student reference here, student object here into save method. That's it. Hibernate is going to save data on table. Here you can ask me a logic that how it will recognize on which table it is going to insert. In database, right, we generally will have schemas, multiple schemas. We will have each schema again will have multiple tables. So how Hibernate will recognize on which table this data is going to be inserted. So I have a table here, student 007. Student 007 is my database table. How it will recognize this data is going to save on the student 007 table. So for Hibernate, we do one mapping file. We create one mapping file to understand where to this object should save. Okay, where this object need to save. In Hibernate, we create one mapping file for each bean class, right? For each bean class and for each table, we create one mapping file. Consider like student.hbm. We call it as HBM, Hibernate mapping file. Student.hbm.xml. Is it mandatory to add HBM? Really not mandatory, but you add. Okay, to understand this XML file is Hibernate mapping file. In this mapping file, what we will do? So this is my class. The class name is student, and the student class need to map to table name called student 007. This configuration we do here. So this class need to map to this table. So by reading this configuration, Hibernate will understand, okay, he is trying to save student data on this student 007 table. Fine. You have multiple properties, name, email, address. So the property name I have, name where you want to save, on which column you want to save. The column name also you can specify here. If the columns and names are different, let's say in database you have different column names. Okay, the column names are different from the database column names. So something s name, s email, s address, different column names if you have, then you can configure the column names also here. In my bean class the property name is email, but in my table the column name is s name. Okay, fine. S name, s email, s address, you have different naming conventions. Here you have one different name and here you have different name. Okay, you can do that mapping also here. So finally this mapping file intention is what? To understand where your data need to save. This bean data need to save into which table, and each property need to save it into which column in that table. So that will be identified from this mapping file. Without this mapping file, Hibernate is having not that much intelligence to identify your table and insert. Okay, this mapping file also we create, and we load this configuration also here into this Hibernate. Okay, then Hibernate will understand when you call the save method, and try to save the student data, it will refer your mapping file and it will understand. Okay, you want to do save operation. Save means insert operation. It will generate an insert query here. When you use save operation, Hibernate will understand. Okay, you want generate insert query. It will generate insert query, insert into table. So which table? This table name. It will find the table name here. Okay, insert into student 007. And what about values? So we are saying read values from this name, email, address, and where you want to save. S name, S email, address, S address. So it will create insert into student 007 S name, S email, S address. Values are name, email, address. That's it. Finally, your data is going to insert into so and so table. So this is how Hibernate will perform. Just what you need to understand is how to map this, or how to map your POSO class to table. That's all. If you understand that, then Hibernate is easy. Okay. So this is the first thing that we need to understand from the Hibernate, how to map POSO to table. Generally, the ORM tool job is here what? Mapping your object to table. The job is mapping your object to table only. So for doing that, we will use this mapping file. Okay, let us see one basic CRUD example here. So I want to save student data on some table. So I created a bean class here. Let me increase the font size. So here is my student POSO class, which is having ID, name, email. Okay, so three properties I have. For each property, I have one setter method and getter method here. So for each property, you need to have one setter and one getter, mandator, one setter method and one getter method for each property. Now this POSO class, I want to save it into a so-and-so table. I have Oracle database here. So this is my database. So here in this database, I want to save the data. You even need not to create any table here. Hibernate will create the table automatically. Okay, so that is also one of its feature. So now I want to save the student bean data on a table. How you will save? So this is how you need to create mapping. Class, your class name. My class name is student, and the table name. On which table you want to save? Create any table name. Okay, ds student spring, or ds spring student 007. This is my table name. Fine. Put any table name here. Don't use any database keywords. Okay. Put any table name here. and your schema name, database schema name here. And from here, from the student table, I have ID, name, email. So this ID, name, email, on which columns you want to store in this table, which columns you want to use. So if you want to create ID, name, email, same names, you can mention the same names. If it is same names, even you need not to mention column here. It will use the same default names. Or if you want to use different names, right? Like DS student ID, DS underscore ID as a column name, and DS name for the name, DS email for email. You can specify your required column names here. So when we run Hibernate, right, it will create this table. On this table, it will create these columns: DS ID, DS name, DS email. Okay, I have a poser class and I have a mapping. Then how to run it? We have both, and you need to mention database connection properties also. Hibernate is having mapping file to where to map your poser class. But to connect with your database, right, you need to provide some configurations like database driver, URL, username, password, all the configurations we need to set up, right? For that configurations, we create one file name called Hibernate configuration file. Hibernate.cfg.xml. CFG stands for configuration. So we create one configuration file. There we will mention all the driver, URL, username, passwords. Okay. So and your mapping file also. Whatever number of mappings you have, right? All that mapping files we configure here. All the mapping files we configure here. So this one also we need to load it into Hibernate container. Okay. So your mapping file will load through Hibernate configuration only. Configuration will have all Hibernate database. I mean, to which database you want to connect, all the database configurations. So in Hibernate, what we do, this is the configuration style, Hibernate configuration, and there is a child tag called session factory. In between session factory, we pass all our configurations. This is the driver name, URL, username, password with default connection pool also here. See the beauty. So they given connection pool support also. Just you need to mention the number of connections you want. Internally, Hibernate will create connection pool. And there is one important property, very important property, like your driver URL, username, password, right? You need to mention dialect. You need to mention dialect. What is the use of this dialect is? So by using this dialect only, Hibernate will understand. As I said, right, Hibernate is going to generate automatic SQL queries. When you call save method, automatically auto SQL query it will generate. But which database understandable SQL query it will generate? So to understand which database understandable query it need to generate, right? We pass dialect here. So by giving dialect, we mention that, hey, Hibernate, use Archil based SQL queries only. If you mention Archil dialect, it will generate Oracle understandable SQL queries. If you mention here MySQL, MySQL understandable SQL queries. If you mention here DB2, DB2 understandable SQL queries. So if you don't mention dialect here, then it will confuse which database understandable queries I need to generate. Okay. So to make sure that your SQL queries are going to run on Archil database or MySQL database, you need to mention that particular database dialect here. So this is one important configuration. And HBM to DDL, there is a beautiful configuration. We have HBM to DDL. So already you given a mapping file, right? So from this mapping file, shall I create a table? I understand that you need this table and these columns. So from this property, what it is saying, shall I create a table? Yes, if you want to create a table. If you mention create, what it will do, it will read your mapping file. Anyway, you configured your mapping file right here. It will read your mapping file. From this mapping file, it will read your table name and column names. It will create a table automatically. When you mention HBM to DDL, create. Now, how to insert? Let's see. So like our IOC application context, we have one configuration class. This is the Hibernate container class. Like how we have application context in Spring, right? Here we have a configuration class. This is Hibernate container. Okay, this is the Hibernate container class. So this is going to manage all your Hibernate beans. So that's why we call it as Hibernate container class. So into this Hibernate container class, you need to load your Hibernate XML file, right? And you need to call build session factory. When you call build session factory, by using all these properties, it will create a connection pool, and internally it will create multiple connections. Okay, so you need to call this build session factory. Once done with this build session factory, you need to get a session. Session means a connection it will provide for doing insert operations. Okay, this is the default thing that always we follow until open session. We create a container, we load XML file, and we build session factory, then we open a session. Then thereafter, how to save. So I created one student object with ID. Okay, consider we have student ID 1, in the student ID 2, and student ID 3. Okay, so I have three records here. I have three records here. How to save these three records? Simple. We have session dot save method. So already we created a session, right? Already we created a session. Basically, when you save, right, whatever ID we have saved primary key, right, the same ID it will return. Just I am getting that ID here. So when you call save method, into save method we are giving student 1 object, student 2 object, student 3 object. So we are saving three objects. When you save three objects, so when it's success, right, it will return 1 here, your ID, and it will return 2 here, it will return 3 here, same primary key values it will return. So once done with the save operation, you need to do commit. Okay, session dot begin transaction commit. Then this data will be committed into database. So finally, you are done. Your data will be inserted. You are not doing any SQL queries here. Just save method you are calling. That's it. Internally, it will generate SQL queries and it will insert. Now save it. So it is showing success and the ID is inserted 1, 2, 3. Really? So this is our table. Let's go and check whether this table is created or not. Select star from student ds spring student 007. Yes, table created with the ds id, ds name, ds email, and your data also inserted. Your data also inserted. Okay, so but I didn't see any SQL queries here. No SQL query. How it saved? Internally it will generate. There is a query engine in Hibernate. That query engine will take care. If you want to see that internally generated SQL queries, we can see that. We need to enable that log. Show SQL. Show dot SQL or show SQL. Show SQL. Show SQL true. True. It's show SQL or show dot SQL something. Okay. Now run it. Once again, if I run, what will happen? It will drop the table and it will recreate it. Hmm. What happened? Show SQL, I should be able to see. When you configure, show SQL true. Logs are not showing here. Basically, it will show all the SQL internal queries. Okay, I'll verify that why it's happening. Okay, show underscore SQL, I believe. Show underscore SQL. Show underscore SQL. Yeah, run once again. Again and again, when you run, it will drop. It will create. Okay. See what is happening internally. Even it will delete the table also. That DDL also we applied, right? It will drop and create tables also. That is not showing here. Only insert we are saying, right? Insert into table, DS name, DS email, DS ID, values. So this is how internally it will generate SQL queries and it will save your data. So basically Hibernate also going to use SQL only internally, but that you are not going to do here. You need not to do that. Okay, again and again when I run this configuration, table will be deleted and recreated. So if you don't want to do that, just put it to update. So when you put update, it will not create. If you want to add any new columns, that new columns it will what we say, it will alter when you use update. Or update is for alter operations. So now I want to select records, or I want to update the records. So I want to update the record. I want to update one record, the first record. So this is the record that I inserted. So from this record, I want to update this email ID. Get Gmail to Ymail, I want to update. So just what you need to do, session.update method, you should call. That's it. For doing save operation, save method. For doing update operation, update method. That's it. Run it. So the record one is updated. See what it is doing. Student name, email, address. Sorry, name, email. It is updating where ID. But I didn't give a name. By default, null value would be there. It might be erased the name. Yeah, name gone. So we need to little careful, right? While doing update operation, whether you need to fetch the record first and update it, or else you need to pass the complete data. Student 2 dot set name. So internally update query, update table, set name, email, where ID. So this ID it is using as a primary key. So where this ID, it is updating these two values. So this is how you can do basic save and update operations. If you want to delete, simple. Yeah, data updated. If you want to delete it, use just simple delete method. So how to do delete operation? Just create your student object with ID. So whatever record you want to delete, the first record I want to delete, give ID 1 and pass the record into delete method. That's it. Before deleting, it is checking whether that record is there or not. First it is checking the record. If record exists, then only it is deleting it. First it is making sure that that record is existing or not. If exists, then it is deleting it. So the first record is gone, deleted. So for doing delete operations, simple delete method we should use. Okay, see how simple it is. Just creating a bean and calling save method or update method or delete method. For doing select operations also it is simple. We use simple get method for doing select operations. Okay, so if you want to select data, we have get method. So using get method, I'm trying to getting one is not there. We have two, primary key 2 and primary key 3 values we have. So we will get the data from the table. So check the table name, whether the table name we using this, right? In this next get example, yeah, change the table name and the column names also different. Let me replace this XML with this. Okay. Now when I use get method, right? When I use get student object, we are saying I need student object, which is having primary key, who is having primary key 2 and who is having primary key 3. When we call get, internally it will do the select operation. It know on which table it need to get the data. Okay. When we do the select operation by giving, cannot open connection. The problem might be password. Password is changed. Yeah. So we got two records, two select operations it is doing internally, and we get the records here. So this is how we can do select operations. We can use get method, and there is a load method also. There are two different approaches. One is using get and one is using load. Using load also we can get, using get also we can get. We can use load method also. So load is a little different, though it will get the data. It will get the data after primary key only. When you call non-primary key, until unless you call this, it is not firing SQL query. See, I'm trying to printing ID and name both. So ID printed first, then SQL query generated, which means before you calling name, right, it is firing SQL query. Until unless you call non-primary key properties, load will not react, which is lazy. We call it as lazy select operation. Until unless you call non-primary key. Generally IDs would be primary key, name, email address, such parameters you have. Until unless you call non-primary key, load will not respond. Whereas in get, right, we are trying to printing name, email. So before the name email itself, before you are trying to fetching the, come on, before you are trying to fetching your name email itself, the select operations will be fired. See, the first select operation is fired when you call the get method itself. Then it is ready with data. Whereas in load is different. Until unless you call non-primary key, it will not fetch any data for you. So this is how basic CRUD operations we can do in Hibernate. This is how basic CRUD operations we do in Hibernate. So not only that, while doing insertions, we are giving IDs, right? Generally giving IDs from user is not recommended. So as a user, we are supplying IDs here. So when we do reservation, like a ticket reservation in the flight or a booking cinema ticket or booking a train ticket or bus ticket, you will get a ID. You will get a reference ID, but that IDs we never enter. We select our required seat and we enter our name, gender, and our email and mobile number only while doing the bus booking. Who will generate this ID? System need to generate. Okay, basically this is the ID that system need to generate. We should not allow user to enter the IDs, his IDs. Let's say if you join into some university as a student, university need to generate one ID for you. You should not choose the ID. Okay, so that auto ID generation features also we have here. Auto ID, auto ID generation features also we have here. Many features. So IDs can be generated automatically. IDs can be generated automatically. Mm, okay, no problem. So when you want to generate ID, automatic IDs, right? What we do is we configure here a generator. We configure a generator, ID generator we configure. Between ID and ID, right? There is a tag name called a generator. We configure generators here. There are many generators are available. Okay, there are many generators are available. One is generator auto or increment. When you configure this increment, what will do for the first user, it will start using 1. From the next user onwards, it will use the next incrementation plus 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 1. So when I try to insert 3 records, let's try to insert 3 records without IDs. Once again, drop tables and create it. So just change this property to create. Increment is a generator. Increment is a generator. What it will do is, first it will get the maximum ID from your table. Okay, it will get the max ID. As we deleted the table and created, right, max ID, it will get 0, and it will do +1 incrementation while doing first record insertion. I inserted a first record, so it will do +1 on 0, so that it will use 1 for this user. For this user, it will use 2. For this user, it will use 3. So now if you see the select query, you can see these IDs are auto-generated. Okay, so auto-generated IDs, if you want to use, you need to use increment. Similar like increment, we have multiple other configurations like sequences, which are recommended basically. So the sequences we can configure here. We can configure custom sequences. I'll attach all that examples. Okay, have a look about generators also. Okay, for doing automatic primary key generation. Okay, automatic primary key generation. So I forget to tell you, right? So when you use this ID means primary key. Okay, ID means primary key. So only primary key property you need to configure here. Remaining non-primary key properties you can configure by using property tag. Is it mandatory to have primary key? As per database rules, it is recommended to have one primary key in your table. Primary key means what? Non-duplicate value. So when you have a primary key, it is easy to identify that record. Even if you don't have this ID, what will happen? A primary key field. If somebody have same name and same, I mean, email might not have, but if they enter the same data, name, address, some data which is common to both of them, we will confuse how to get his data. So in the query, we need to put then select start from record where name equal to something and email equal to something and address equal to something. We need to do multiple filter operations if we don't have primary key. So that's why it is recommended in database to having a primary key. So if you have primary key is unique. So I inserted one record, which is Surender. Here I have with ID 1. So by using ID 1, I can able to get the data. So that's why it is recommended to configure primary key here. By using ID, when we configure a column, it will treat it as a primary key. So Hibernate strictly saying use a primary key. Without primary key, you should not create any table. Primary key is mandatory. Okay. Now select operation, right? Select operations we have done by using get method and load method. Using simple get, you can give your class name and you can pass ID so that you can get the data. In case if you want to write query style also, if there are any complex queries also you can write, but the query style looks like this. So if you want to select a row by using query, we create a HQL queries. We create HQL queries like this. We don't write select a star from table name. Instead of that, what we write is from bean. Instead of giving table name, we give bean name, where ID equal to required ID value. Okay, this is named parameter. So just we can set the named parameter here. So you need to create a query, and there is a method name called session.createQuery. You need to pass your HQL query here. Then query dot set the I value. Here the I value we set, whether it is 1 or 2, whatever argument it is. And finally, when you call query dot unique result, it will give you result. So this is one other way. By using queries also, we can able to get the data. Why we need this feature? Because when you want to write custom queries, many times we write custom queries, right? That custom queries also you can write, but on object, not on table. HQL means Hibernate query language. Hibernate query language we write on beans, not on tables. Internally, it will understand, okay, he is trying to write query on this bean, so that I need to query on associated table. The same I give an ID here. This is bean property. When you give bean property, it will understand, okay, the associated ID column property is ds underscore ID. Internally, it will do select operation on that particular ID column. Okay, that is how the SQL works. I mean HQL works. So using HQL also you can do select operations. Okay, so yeah, so this is all it. So we can do basic CRUD operations by using Hibernate, insert, update, deletes. Hibernate is having auto DDL feature. Automatically it will create tables by using this feature to see the queries internally generated. We use this show SQL, and to map our bean class to tables we use Hibernate config mapping file. There we map our bean to this table, so that when we do save operation or update or select whatever Hibernate operation you do by using this mapping file only, it will understand on which table it is going to do that so and so CRUD operations. So here we map all our properties. Primary key especially we configure using ID, and for non-primary key we use properties only. So in case IDs, if you want to generate automatically, we can generate by using generator class. There are many automatic generators: increment, sequence, identity. Okay, custom generators also we can put. Let's say you are building application for your organization. Let's say you join into IBM. For IBM employee IDs, they want to generate like IBM. They want to start with IBM 10101. So that generator we need to implement. So from for the next user, IBM 10102, IBM 10103, IBM 10104, like that. If you want to do the generations, we can do that custom generator also. So I'll post you all that examples. Go one by one. Tomorrow I'll show you the basic criterias and the mappings. Okay. So I'll attach all.
Naveen sir,
Yeah.
any need to configure Hibernate jar file?
Yes. Hibernate jar files also required. I'll share the jars. So these all are Hibernate jars. Like Spring jar files, you need to add Hibernate jar files also.
Okay.
Well, mostly I'll send these examples through email, okay? Because it will take little time for me to add in that blog. So I'll send it immediately through email. I'll zip all these examples and I'll send it to you. Okay. So this is the basic understanding I'm expecting from you from the Hibernate. So I hope you understand how Hibernate works here. Okay. Are we clear?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, cool. So tomorrow also I'll show you the mappings. I'll tell you the importance of mappings. How to map if table wants to connect with another table with one-to-one mapping, or one-to-many, many-to-one, or many-to-many mapping. How to do that mappings I'll show. Okay. And there are some hierarchical scenarios like table per class, table per subclass, table per concrete class. So these are the normalization techniques. Do we need to use only one table for our scenario, or two tables, or three tables? Generally the normalization techniques: table per class, table per subclass, or concrete class. Okay, we discussed this normalization techniques as well as mappings along with criteria and the catching examples tomorrow. Okay, I'll quickly go through them, then we can jump back to Spring again. Okay, yeah,
Yes.
even yeah. Why I'm giving this is as a added content here is right for your interview sake. Generally, really need not to have that much knowledge, but while doing Spring with Hibernate integrations, when you want to, or when you see any custom generator classes, or when you see the caching supplied, you should not surprise when you see the mappings one to many or many to many. You should not surprise here why these annotations came here. Okay, those all are Hibernate annotations we use for doing mappings, and we used to use them for doing incrementations and all. So there also we use Hibernate annotations instead of using this XML based, right? In Spring we use Hibernate annotations. Using Hibernate annotations, we do the mapping to tables. I'll show you all the approaches using XML approach, how to do the mappings, using annotations, how to do the mappings, end to end you will get ready. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all for today. I'll send these examples today itself. Okay. So have a look, and
Naveen sir, I want to share the screen 1 minute.
okay, yeah. Please go ahead. me stop recording.